Isabella was only 10 when word arrived that she and her brother had been ordered to go to the king's court in Segovia. Arevalo may have been a lonely outpost in the kingdom of Castile, but it was the only home she had ever known. Everything familiar was there, including her mother, who at this point was in the depths of a profound depression. The Queen Mother at times would barely speak, only looking up to gaze upon her daughter with sad eyes. The young princess and her even younger brother had no choice but to comply with the king's command. The two children were taken from their mother and arrived at the Castilian court in 1462 to meet the king's new heir, who happened to be a girl and was given the name the Infanta Joana, but was later given the nickname La Beltraneja. This was a slur, created by the nobility as a declaration of her presumed illegitimacy. The royal court in Segovia was a politically dangerous place. Isabella was surrounded by the intrigue of the aristocracy, people that had motives and agendas, and not always were they in line with the good of the royal family. Isabella would take solace in the words of her astute grandmother, Isabel of Barcelos, which guided her through this dark hour of her life. Composure, child. Observe first, and let your reactions come from a place of control. These words would forever echo in her mind. It was now 6 years later, and Castile was in the middle of a civil war. Isabella, who at this point was 16 years old, had backed up her younger brother Alfonso in a rebellion against her older brother, King Henry IV. But then everything had gone very wrong in the blink of an eye. She was now brought into the chamber where the corpse of her younger brother Alfonso resided. She knew, looking at her deceased sibling, that she had lost the civil war. Gazing upon him, or at least what was left of him, she repressed her intense sadness. Instead, her mind went to work calculating her next move. Composure, child. Observe first. The tongue was bloated and black. The skin showed signs of dehydration, and yet nobody else was sick. This couldn't have been plague or infection, as everybody else was calling it. Her articulate mind knew right away he was poisoned, he was murdered. The real question was by whom? She thought back for a moment. What was it that the Roman orator Cicero would say? Cui bono? Who would benefit most? King Henry IV first came to mind, but she doubted that her older brother was capable of fratricide. Closing her eyes, she began to think of the nobility. After shuffling through the pantheon, eventually her mind settled on Juan Pacheco. He was a nobleman of immense prestige, the Marquis of Villena and Master of the Order of Santiago, someone who would stop at nothing to seize more power. In the past, he had arranged for his vile brother Pedro Giron to marry Isabella, a ploy, by the way, that would have put his family in line to take the throne. More importantly, several years prior, he had led the charge to depose King Henry IV and install the Prince Alfonso as the new ruler. There were rumors that he felt that he could control the prince much better. But despite his ruthless ambition, Juan Pacheco was known to have shifting loyalties. Isabella's mind raced. Perhaps he had lost faith in the young Alfonso. Perhaps he felt he could control the king with more authority now. If he had changed sides to back up the king once again and had plotted to kill Alfonso, he would likely strike again if her brother's death was exposed as a murder. Who would he kill next? Would it be her older brother, King Henry this time? Or would it be the next in line to rule, meaning herself? Composure, child. Let your reactions come from a place of control. Looking up from the body of her younger brother, she announced to all around her, "This was the work of the plague. My poor brother was unable to resist the sickness. There is nothing more for us to do now than simply mourn this unfortunate accident." These words were acknowledged by the kingdom and then the rest of the nobility. But then the demands began to come in. Juan Pacheco wanted to take the princess into his own personal custody to protect her from the plague, of course. He immediately suggested that Isabella marry King Alfonso of Portugal right away. The Archbishop of Toledo, who had grown extremely wary of Juan Pacheco, countered. He suggested that Isabella instead should marry Ferdinand of Aragon. Now keep in mind that the demands of these two men, while coming from places of contempt and a sense of protection, respectively, would have removed Isabella from the line of succession. Then there were also the remaining supporters of Isabella's younger brother Alfonso, who demanded that she continue the rebellion against King Henry. The city of Seville had even gone so far as to declare her queen. So what would it be? Exile and marriage, or destruction in a disastrous civil war? Isabella had held her composure, she had observed well, and her reaction came from a place of control. She declared that the rebellion was over, that she would be loyal to the king, her older brother, once again, if he would have it so. But her statement also came with her own demands. She was recalled as saying, quote, "Return the kingdom to King Henry, my brother, and thus you will restore peace to Castile. But if you hold me daughter of the King John, my lord and father, and worthy of the name, have the king, my brother, declare me to be the successor to the realm. This I will take as the greatest service you can render me. So long as King Henry may live, I will not take over the government, nor will I call myself queen. But I will make every effort to the end that King Henry, while he lives, may govern this realm better than he has done." End quote. Oh, and one more thing. Part of the agreement, and a smart move at that, also stated that Isabella would never have to marry against her will. Now the ball was in King Henry's court. It was up to him to decide what to do next. To be completely fair, this really wasn't so much a gamble for Isabella. She knew her brother's personality well and surmised what his response would be. King Henry agreed. He wanted peace. Juan Pacheco, on the other hand, was both shocked and angry. It quickly dawned on him that he had been outmaneuvered by a teenager. In August of 1468, an agreement was reached. Peace would be restored to the land. Henry would be the undisputed king, but at the same time, Isabella was now the heir to Castile, and no one could tell her who to marry. Meanwhile, as Isabella was securing her spot in the line of succession, King Henry's wife, the beautiful Joan of Portugal, had been busy herself. While the Castilian king was off and away, engaged in the civil war, the queen, and I should emphasize, separated from him, had given birth again. There was no dispute now. This new child was illegitimate. Henry was beyond angry, and understandably so. He immediately renounced his daughter Joana la Beltraneja's claim to the crown, and then he had his wife, Joan of Portugal, banished from court. For a very brief moment, Isabella took in a breath of relief. Initially, things began to fall in line for Isabella. She found herself for the next 9 months in Ocaña, where she surrounded herself with loyal supporters. As she expanded her base of followers, her brother, the king, bestowed upon her the vaunted title, Princess of Asturias. This title implied that she would be the next in line to rule, but the name Asturias itself held meaning beyond just the political realm. It was the name of the first Christian kingdom to emerge in the wake of the Islamic conquest in the early 8th century. It was in this northernmost part of Iberia that the Reconquista was said to have begun, with Don Pelayo's victory at the Battle of Covadonga. Thus, for Isabella, this wasn't just simply a title, but the call to become a holy warrior, something that she would definitely take to heart. The now Princess of Asturias was also given jurisdiction over territories, including the revenues from places such as Medina del Campo, a wealthy trading center. Along the same lines, Isabella began to correspond with other nobles and oversee royal events. In essence, she was grooming herself to lead. However, it was not long before she would face problems. As soon as her rebel army had disbanded, King Henry began to hold back on his promises, mainly guided by Juan Pacheco, whose hatred of the young princess was at this point common knowledge. Henry began to cut off revenue from cities that were otherwise promised to Isabella. He also began to be swayed by Joan of Portugal, his wife, still in exile, mind you, to reinstate his daughter as heir. And if that was not enough, the king also began to pressure Isabella to marry outside the kingdom once again. The first suitor to show up was Richard of England, the younger brother of Edward IV. If you recall, Edward had rejected Isabella in the past, so it wasn't really much of a surprise when the deal fell through. But don't feel bad. In historical retrospective, Isabella had dodged the proverbial bullet on this one. This Richard that we're talking about would one day be Richard III, who, for those not familiar, he would enter into the winter of his discontent, destined to meet a rather nasty end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, after his country had erupted into a horrendous civil war. Richard was to be the last of the Plantagenet line, and many in his royal family were, to say this nicely, purged as the Tudor dynasty came to power. For the Castilian king, it would be back to the drawing board. On April 30th, 1469, Henry IV had entered into negotiations with Alfonso V of Portugal again in an attempt to marry his sister off. The terms of the deal seemed a little desperate. Part of the agreement was that Alfonso could call himself Prince of Asturias, if you recall how important that was. And here's the best part. If Isabella refused, the Portuguese would be given the green light to declare war on Isabella. To call it a strong-arm approach would be a bit of an understatement. Isabella, however, would have nothing to do with this. You see, as her brother the king had been scheming to accomplish his own ends, she had been scheming to accomplish her own ends. Unknown to King Henry, Isabella this entire time had been making plans to get married on her own. The national pastime of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon was to figure out a way to take over Castile. It was an obsession with the Aragonese kings. They just needed to figure out a way to do it. They tried military options, then diplomatic means, then they tried to marry their way in. The king of Aragon at this time was John II. The man was an empire builder. In 1419, John had married the Queen of Navarre, Blanca or Blanche I. When she died in 1441, he declared himself the King of Navarre. King John II now held power in the lands of Navarre, Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, but the man always wanted just a little more, and looked at Castile with greedy eyes. John and Blanca I had 3 children, Carlos, Blanca II, and Eleanor. Blanca II, again anglicized Blanche, was sent to Castile to become Henry IV's first wife. It was kind of a requirement of a peace treaty between the two kingdoms. King John II now had exactly what he wanted. All he had to do was await for his daughter to produce an heir for King Henry IV so he could make a better claim to add Castile to his domain. Simple enough, right? King John waited a year, then a decade, and then longer. But as fate would have it, Henry IV and Blanche II, despite 13 years of marriage, produced no heir, and the marriage was eventually annulled. Blanche was sent home in disgrace and essentially imprisoned by her family for, lack of a better phrase, failure to act. Eventually, she was even poisoned. King John II of Aragon would have to try again. At the age of 54, he decided to remarry. He chose a 19-year-old noblewoman by the name of Juana Enriquez. They ended up having 2 children. a daughter named Juana, and then an especially dashing young man named Ferdinand, who was born in 1452. Ferdinand would quickly become the king's favorite, which would strain the relations with his other children. His wife, Queen Juana, didn't help the situation. She was quite the spiteful, evil stepmother to the other kids. John II's oldest son, Carlos, began to resent his father. He reasserted himself, opposed his father, and claimed the kingdom for himself, which, granted, was kind of his birthright, but this was quasi-civil war. The kingdom of Aragon became divided as to who should hold power, King John II or his son, Carlos. The infighting of the royal family was intense. At one point, Carlos was even imprisoned by his own father. However, this brought the country to the brink of civil war, which was led by the people of Catalonia, who had backed up Carlos. In order to bring peace, King John was forced to release his son and declared him to be his heir. But shortly after this declaration, on September 23, 1461, Carlos died suddenly in Barcelona. Poison was suspected, and it was his own stepmother, the Queen Juana, who was the prime suspect. Therefore, in one swift blow, King John's favorite, some would say most controllable son, Ferdinand, at the age of 9, had become the heir of Aragon. King John II, the sovereign of Aragon, now had another chance to take over his neighbor by marriage. But King Henry IV of Castile was well aware of the ambitions of the King of Aragon, who, by the way, had gained the nickname the Faithless. As a result, Henry just simply outright forbade Isabella to marry Ferdinand. But by 1469, Isabella, now 18, had decided it was Ferdinand who she would wed regardless. She was recounted as saying it has to be he and no other. Thus, the two went to work to make this happen. As Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins, they had to get a special dispensation from the Pope to make the marriage legal. This was a super important point, as otherwise their kids would be deemed illegitimate. King Henry IV and Juan Pacheco, meanwhile, had moved to tighten their control over the princess. They tried to confine her to one spot, watched her every move, and even bribed her ladies-in-waiting to spy on her. However, Isabella caught on to this and figured out a way to get one step ahead. In early August of 1469, she declared she was going to visit her brother's tomb in Arevalo. But as soon as she and her entourage had made it over the horizon, she made a run for it. Isabella made her way in haste from one small town to another, hiding in a convent at one point. Eventually, on August 30th, 1469, she and a few companions arrived at her destination in Valladolid. Ferdinand, too, had a difficult journey. He crossed the Castilian border in the middle of the night with an entourage of 5 trusted companions. He traveled disguised as a mule driver, making his way through remote mountain passes, and arrived the day before Isabella did. Now, the two of them had corresponded back and forth for some time, and when they met, there was no disappointment, but there was some major encanto. On October 19, 1469, in the Great Hall of Valladolid, the two were married. Downey picks up the tale. Quote, "Their family histories may have been tangled, but one aspect of the young couple's early life together was simple and self-evident: their chemistry. They had seen each other for the first time on October 14, 1469. They were married within the week. And 3 months later, Isabella was pregnant." King Henry's infertility had been a source of shame and worry for the nation, but Isabella had proven her own fruitfulness in a remarkably short time. Observers noted with satisfaction that the relationship appeared to be both warm and passionate. Both were strong and physically fit, energetic and decisive. Isabella was the more intellectual of the two, enjoying the company of scholars and people of romantic temperament. Ferdinand was a man of action with great personal charm. Isabella was eager to have a child, and Ferdinand was, well, happy to do his part to make it happen. In addition to their physical bond, the two teenagers had much in common. They were both Spaniards, inoculated from birth with the same beliefs about their nation's history, destiny, and challenges. Furthermore, Ferdinand and Isabella had psychological and emotional similarities as well. They had both been raised in the shadow of older siblings who were expected to rule. Both had grown up surrounded by war and civil unrest, which made them feel exposed and vulnerable to danger even as children. As a result, both were determined to bring to the job of governing the kind of determination that had previously been lacking." End quote. Now, despite the happiness that the new couple was enjoying, there was one in the kingdom who was decidedly unhappy. When King Henry IV got the news of the wedding, he was furious. Isabella attempted to contact him to reconcile things, but the king's responses were few and malicious when they came, and perhaps understandably so. Guided by Juan Pacheco, the king of Castile went to work to undermine his half-sister with everything he had. He began to align the nobility against Isabella, with noted effect. Her support in the Castilian court began to fall apart. Henry then cut off as many sources of income for the couple as he could, and then, after that, he got really nasty. It was suddenly discovered that the papal dispensation that Isabella and Ferdinand had received to get married was no longer viable. Thus, any offspring that they had would not only be illegitimate, but they would never be heir to the kingdom. Isabella got this news just days before she went into labor with her first child, a birth, by the way, that she barely survived. Shortly thereafter, on October 26, 1470, King Henry formally disinherited Isabella. He renounced her claim to the throne and announced that his daughter, Joanna la Beltraneja, would once again be his heir. For Isabella, this was a truly dark time. She was impoverished, disinherited, recovering from a dangerous childbirth, and had also learned that her new husband had been unfaithful. But despite all this, she was determined to get it all back. The only question was how. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in a small town near Valencia. His first language was Catalan. In time, he'd be considered a Spaniard. He came from a rich, powerful, affluent family. Indeed, his uncle was a pope. Growing up in the Renaissance, the man had an affection for the indulgences of both the mind and the body, which is a nice way of saying that he just couldn't seem to resist temptation, and on more than one occasion, his colleagues would ask him to tone it down a bit. But the man also had a lot of power and just happened to be in the right place at the right time. With his influence, a close friend of his was elected into the papacy. His buddy became Pope Sixtus IV. This pope, by the way, would go on to establish the Vatican records, upgraded Rome, and built the Sistine Chapel. Not bad indeed. As it just so happened, the Ottoman Turks, at this point in history, were making some major gains in Europe. In 1472, Rodrigo was sent back home to Iberia to recruit some help. One of his first stops was the Kingdom of Aragon. Here he met King John II and his son Ferdinand, who happened to be home visiting. The three men hit it off famously. For them, it was a big fiesta. It was during this time that the cardinal was convinced by Ferdinand to travel to Alcalá de Henares, a place that Isabella had turned into her base of operations. Rodrigo Borgia was entranced with the princess. He found her motivation to be inspirational. Isabella, after all, had been working relentlessly since the birth of her first child 2 years prior to re-establish her power base. She had already convinced the Archbishop of Toledo to join her, and had brought many nobles to her side with promises of lands and titles. The fact that her brother, the king, was doing such a poor job and had allowed chaos and massive civil strife to consume the kingdom of Castile only helped her cause. Isabella was enamored by the cardinal, especially his intellect and his insight into art and culture. What's more, the two saw each other as being powerful political partners for the future. Thus, when Rodrigo returned to Rome, he remained fascinated by the princess and her husband, so much so that he used his influence to re-establish their marriage papal dispensation. Suddenly, Isabella and Ferdinand had powerful backers in the Vatican, and their children could once again inherit the realm. The eyes of the aristocracy began to look at the couple more and more as the true sovereigns. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia would one day be the scandalous Pope Alexander VI. Folks, look him up. This man would turn Rome into his own private house of pleasure. But despite all of his hedonism and crass behavior, he would never forget Isabella. The princess had done much to regain her power and prestige. Now she had to take on a much bigger task: reconciliation. It was a cold day on December 29, 1473, but something extraordinary was about to happen. After 4 long years, King Henry IV and Isabella had agreed to meet in Segovia. The tension between brother and sister was high. There was, after all, much unresolved animosity. Now, why King Henry IV agreed to do this is still up for debate. Clearly, his most trusted advisor, Juan Pacheco, had strenuously objected to the meeting. One argument was that the king had his back against the wall. Castile had descended into a lawless kingdom. Murder, rape, theft was rampant. As such, the nobility had shifted even more to Isabella's side. That said, everybody expected the siblings to fail in their negotiations. But once again, Isabella held her composure. Her responses came from a place of control. Kirsten Downey describes the scene, quote, "When at last the reunion between Henry and Isabella occurred, the angry feelings dissipated in moments. Despite all the animosity of the previous years, brother and sister were genuinely pleased to see each other. Henry was in a happy mood, having just returned from a hunting trip, and Isabella was waiting for him in the Alcazar, where she welcomed him with grave humility. He greeted her with delight and embraced her lovingly. The two wandered off to a nearby room where they sat down together. She swore her loyalty, apologized for having offended him, and asked him to please consider the good consequences for Castile of her marriage to Ferdinand." End quote. In the subsequent days, the warmth in the royal household only improved further. Ferdinand was invited and formally introduced to King Henry, who was warm in reception. New Year's was a joyous time, and everybody in the kingdom was shocked at just how well things were going. Perhaps in their reconciliation, there was some hope for the kingdom after all. But not all were content. Forces were at work against the reunion already. On January 9, 1474, during a lavish meal, King Henry unexpectedly fell ill. He lost all his energy and began to have horrendous stomach pain. His lips started to turn black. Isabella had seen this before with her younger brother, but before she could say anything, Juan Pacheco suddenly appeared and accused Isabella of poisoning the king. He demanded that Henry arrest her immediately. The king thought about it, but refused to do so. But Juan Pacheco's accusation had had its effect. Henry would never again fully trust his sister, and the two departed on poor terms. Over the next year, Henry's health and stamina failed. He relegated more and more authority to Juan Pacheco, who in turn attempted to undermine Isabella with everything he had. Pacheco during this time gained considerable power, and his animosity towards the princess had reached a climax.
There are even some that say that he was going to imprison or assassinate her. Fate, however, would intervene. On October 4th, 1474, Juan Pacheco came down with what historians called a throat infection. His death came surprisingly quick. Some could argue that the man might have been poisoned. But again, posterity recorded this as a simple infection. History, after all, is written by the victor, whoever she might be. Juan Pacheco's death was a serious blow to Henry. The king's health spiraled, it plummeted downwards, and he would never recover. King Henry IV took his last breath in the early morning hours of December 11th, 1474. It was said that on his deathbed he declared his daughter, Joana la Beltraneja, now 13, to be his heir. However, no will could be found. The throne of Castile was now vacant. Isabella now had a fleeting moment in history to take it all, but the path was extremely dangerous. Portugal would want Castile. It would lay claim via King Henry's wife and daughter. Aragon could likewise claim it through Ferdinand. Castile, after all, per law, needed a king, and no woman had ruled it in over 200 years. If the Castilian princess was to take the crown, she'd be risking all-out war with both of her neighbors. And as this would also be seen as a coup, she'd be risking a massively destructive civil war in a kingdom that was already on the verge of disintegrating. To many, this would have been too serious of a challenge, a suicide mission even. But for Isabella, this was an opportunity. Her moment of destiny had arrived. She was going to seize the throne of Castile for herself or die in the process.
Digo lo que siento, escucha lo que pienso. Cuando tú vas yo vuelvo, yo te traigo lo bueno. Yo solo sigo mi camino, no me importa el destino. Voy donde sople el viento, no te miento si te digo. Nada me para, vengo con todo, saben bien, yo domino el juego.